Off you go.
All right. So thank you for joining the session today, you in the room and you online. So our session today is all about integrating evidence. Before we get into the content, I just wanted to provide a quick overview and reminder of some of this writing communication support that is available at the library. Basically, if you're working on something that has to do with writing or communication and you need a little help, come to the library. So we have different workshops throughout the year. We also have some workshop recordings online, different resources online. And the Writing Help Center is open throughout the year. So if you're looking to get one-to-one feedback on your work, then you can work with a trained tutor. There's no cost, and the process of going through that exchange of seeing how a reader is responding to your work is so critical to our development as communicators, because it helps us to get outside of ourselves and to appreciate whether or not the intent of our work is being received in the way that we want it to be. We also have English as an additional language support programming, and we have different activities and events throughout the year. So I facilitate productivity sessions. So if you're like me and you struggle a little bit with focus or procrastination, it can be really useful to connect with other people and commit to doing focused work for a certain period of time. So the in-person sessions this June happen on Monday mornings, and then there are virtual sessions Wednesday evenings and Friday mornings. But if you have questions about this presentation or about writing in general, and you're not quite sure who to reach out to, you can start with me. You can send me an email, jill.mcmillan@usaf.ca. And my office is just one floor up in Murray Library. So if you know where the newspapers are, you just sort of walk in there. And if you don't see my office, you just say like, "Where's Jill?" And someone will direct you to where you need to go. Okay. So we're going to begin with a question, and for those of you who are joining us online, feel free to make use of the chat whenever we have some questions. But I'm going to open with this question: what counts as evidence? Our title today is Integrating Evidence. Well, what does evidence actually entail? So what comes to mind?
Data.
Data? Mm-hmm.
I want to make it more broad and say like observations, but maybe coupled with reasons for why. Like you can't just look at something and it's unrelated.
So observations coupled with like logic and inference.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Actual information that supports your idea or what you're trying to prove.
So facts. Anything else?
Existing literature.
Existing literature. Yeah, so when we're talking about evidence, we're talking about a concept that's pretty broad. So we're going to narrow it down a little bit. So we can group it in terms of research and gray literature, as well as data and primary sources. So we're talking about research and gray literature. This includes journal articles, scholarly monographs, government reports, et cetera, if you might be drawing on oral communication, for instance. And then we have data and primary sources. This involves everything from textual evidence, qualitative evidence, quantitative evidence, experimental evidence. For the purposes of our session today, we're really focusing on research and gray literature, but a lot of the principles that we're talking about can also be applicable to when you're writing about data and primary sources. But I do have some recommended resources if that second cluster is what you're most interested in. I'll share those at the end. So why focus on literature? Well, we rely on literature for lots of different reasons in academia. We need it in order to provide contextual information and background knowledge, to establish the current state of knowledge, or to articulate basically what is currently agreed upon within a discipline as it relates to a particular topic. to help support factual statements that we're making, to help provide key terms or concepts to ensure that shared knowledge with our reader, to identify or support a theory, a concept, a theme, to identify a problem or a question, to develop an argument, to identify counter arguments. Basically, we don't do any of the work that we're doing in isolation, right? You're probably familiar with the expression standing on the shoulders of giants. That's what academia is all about. We are building on what other people have done before us. And it might be that we're actually challenging what other people did before us, but we have that literature to really respond to as we are helping to justify why we want to or are researching some other or related topic. And when you think about sort of a conventional academic paper, for instance, you're going to see references to literature throughout, but you're going to see it really dominate in certain sections. Unsurprisingly, in the introduction and literature review, literature is going to be very, very predominant because we need to quite immediately help contextualize a topic or a problem to our readers so that they have some motivation to actually start following along and reading what we're trying to share with them. It's also quite useful to have reference to literature in a method section, especially if we're trying to justify why we've chosen one approach over another, especially if we are sort of moving away from more conventional investigative pathways and trying something different. And then we re-engage with that literature in the discussion and the conclusion, because we're taking what we have discovered and trying to make sense of it. So we often make sense of information by relating it to information that other people have shared with us. So we can use that literature to help reflect on our findings, to compare what we found in relation to what other people have found, and also to start thinking about what the implications might be for future research. Very exciting stuff. So when we're thinking about how we engage with literature, there are a couple of things that we want to keep in mind. The first is we have to ensure that we are operating within a certain spirit, because we know we live in a media environment where it's so easy to cherry pick information and distort what other people have articulated. And in academia, it's so important to make sure that we are engaging with literature with a sense of fairness. So we're not trying to distort, we're not trying to overemphasize, we're not trying to make information more than it is or different than the spirit in which it's been shared with us. So we want to avoid any sensationalism, and we want to be very mindful of what we understand as the intent of the authors and present that as accurately as possible. So we basically want to engage with this information with a sense of fairness. Now, getting some of that conceptual stuff out of the way, let's start talking about some of the technicalities. So the way in which we incorporate evidence is through quotation, paraphrase, summary, and of course, citation. So when do we choose some of these approaches over others? Maybe we'll just do a quick check. So have you received any advice previously around quotation, paraphrase, or summary, for instance? Because this can be quite discipline specific.
So it really depends on like what kind of saying on the site and like what data do you need. Yeah, if like you wanna I don't know, use like one of a huge table, of course you cannot just quote it.
Yeah. So context is often incredibly critical. We have to make discernments all the time about whether we can choose one of these approaches over the other based on whether it's going to make sense for our readers or not, right? Because if we just quote everything, our reader is going to start to wonder, why don't I just read that quoted text instead of this? And it's a little bit tricky, right? Because often we're introduced to integration of evidence through quotation because it's the most accessible means for incorporating reference to other people's work. But as we progress through our studies, we start to realize quotation is sort of like an expensive spice, often best used very sparingly. So we want to be mindful of what the disciplinary norms are and recognize that there's going to be some variation. Broadly speaking, in the humanities and social sciences, quotations tend to be a little bit more common, in part because of the type of evidence that they might be drawing on. So if you are someone who is studying literature, for instance, like poetry, for instance, it's going to make sense to want to quote some of those poems verbatim, rather than rely completely on paraphrase or summary, because those quotations are going to give you something to respond to in your analysis. Conversely, in a lot of STEM areas, quotes tend to be less common. It's not that they're completely abandoned, but they tend to be less popular. But regardless of discipline, paraphrase and summary are predominant. That's going to be the most efficient way in order to make reference to other people's work. And it's also going to help maintain a sense of voice in the writing, because the style in which you write, it's going to be a little bit different compared to the writing of other people. And so if we have a lot of quotes, that can start to interfere with the reader's just reading process, because they have to keep adjusting between different voices. Now, regardless of whether you're using quotation, paraphrase, or summary, citation is essential. We cite for lots of different reasons, and the citing is really at the heart of a lot of the academic enterprise, because again, we want to make sure that people know where this information is coming from. So I've alluded to this already, but this question of, do we quote, do we not quote? Again, very, very context specific. And a couple of questions I would encourage people to keep in mind. If we're including it, why? Is it going to be interrogated in some way? So if you have some information that you really want to engage with, a quotation can actually be quite useful in terms of then providing that opportunity for deep analysis. Alternately, you might ask yourself, okay, if I'm being honest, could I just paraphrase this information? And this is where that sense of discernment comes in, because it is always going to be easiest to quote. Paraphrasing and summary and summarizing are very complex skill sets that often require a lot of thinking and revision, but it's a worthwhile process to go through. And then you want to think about, okay, in my discipline, are scholars using quotations on a fairly regular basis? Am I sort of matching standards in my discipline, or do I need to start reining that impulse in a little bit? So when you're reading within your discipline, you can ask yourself, if I'm noticing quotations, what seems to be the motivation behind that quotation? How are people in my discipline incorporating quotations? So it might be that definitions are being quoted, because if you start to paraphrase a definition, you might lose a little bit of the nuance, or there might be some unique phrasing that we want to capture instead. So let me just move this over a little bit. So here we have a little piece of academic writing, and we have some quotations. This is from an article entitled Parental Perspectives on Immunizations Impact of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Childhood Vaccine Hesitancy. And it reads as follows. Vaccine hesitancy has been defined by the World Health Organization as refusal of vaccines despite availability of vaccine services. More recently, it has been defined by Kempe et al. As a motivational state of being, conflicted about or opposed to getting vaccinated. Global data shows that vaccine hesitancy is prominent in more than 90% of countries worldwide. Vaccine hesitancy can apply to all routine childhood vaccines or specific vaccines, with highest hesitancy directed toward influenza and HPV vaccines. Recent development of COVID-19 vaccines have further pushed vaccine hesitancy to the forefront of discussion. Okay, so we have some quotes. My question to you is, no, I don't want to actually go. All right, why? Why do we have quotations in this instance? And why in both examples do we have the author information included grammatically within the sentence structure? So folks who are online, feel free to make use of the chat box. So why do you think the authors have included these quotations? And why do you think they have included the author information within the structure of the sentence? Yes.
They are both definitions.
Mhm.
And so the wording is precise
Mhm.
in a definition, so you want to keep the exact wording.
Mhm.
And you also want to know who exactly it is. In this case, it's who. And you also want to provide context. So if it wasn't a definition in the sentence structure, you'd probably say that it is this from this person straight in the sentence. It also flows better.
Yeah, so there's some stylistic considerations. There's a nice sense of flow in this writing. It makes sense. We don't want to distort definitions. It's also speaking to a larger context, the fact that, okay, not only do we have these two quotations, they're both quotations of definition, and we're getting a sense that maybe there are some competing definitions, right? Because in academia, things are often in a little bit of flux, right? We keep going back, we keep trying to question, interrogate, revise whether or not something is the best it could be or the most sensible that could be. So in this way, we're very efficiently establishing some shared knowledge with the reader. In this instance, we have the definitions, yes, but this larger sense that these definitions might be in a little bit of flux. And in addition to helping with that sense of flow, the author information in this instance might establish some credibility, right? The World Health Organization is not without its critics, but it is a globally recognized authority on health. We might not know who Kempe and all refer to, but if we were in this world, and maybe some of you are, we might start to have some immediate recognition of who that scholar or researcher is. So when we're thinking about quotations, again, we always want to think about that value add. Okay, so let's talk about how we can think of the different ways in which we approach this integration of literature, of evidence. We're going to talk a little bit about attribution, so making sure that our readers know where to get this information, or that they have a very strong sense of where this information has come from. Signaling, so this relates to the notion of intent. Situating, the role, it speaks to the role of context. And lastly, synthesizing, so when we start to recognize patterns across different sources. Now, with attribution, again, we're going to see some potential disciplinary variation. Author prominent tends to be a little bit more common in the humanities and social sciences, whereas information prominent tends to be a little bit more common in STEM areas. I'm speaking to very, very broad trends. The reality is we see both of these regardless of the discipline. So if you're not familiar with these two concepts, here we just have some comparison. In our author prominent example, we have the following. Smith and Mead assert that language is in constant flux and that to deny this reality is to delude ourselves. In contrast, information prominent, we don't have reference to the authors grammatically within the sentence structure. So the Magdalene Islands are subject to worsening erosion due to slow moving storms caused by climate change. And we have reference to two sources in that instance. So my question to you is, this is a choice. So why are we choosing one of these styles over the other? Why might we have information prominent versus author prominent or vice versa?
Objective and subjective language. And like data as well.
Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
So like when you want to use something like a fact-ish thing, you probably want to focus on the like information itself. But like when you're using like someone's like opinion, like I don't know how do you like define this like properly, but like yeah, those kind of things, you probably want to like use the author's like prominent method, I guess.
Yeah, this notion of like implied objectivity, right? Because you could still make use of information prominent structure with information that is highly subjective, but it could make it seem a little bit more objective. So there is, this is where language can be manipulated, right? But it does speak to this idea that the information stands by itself. Whereas with author prominent, it's not necessarily subjective, but it can be used to heighten a sense of subjectivity. But it can be a way to make reference to debates that are kind of unsettled. It can bring attention to certain voices in this broader academic conversation. It can just be a way to spotlight certain voices over others. So there's value in both approaches. To recap, author prominent, you can make, it helps to make the source more obvious or easy to locate. Or if you want to bring a lot of attention to this notion of a debate, for instance, or to these particular scholars. Whereas information prominent, create a sense of objectivity or neutrality, whether or not that information is actually objective or neutral. And you want to keep the emphasis simply on that information, be it data or results or content. And I've already made reference to this. Really, yes, you might see trends in different disciplines for one approach over the other, but you're going to see these used across disciplines. And you can actually see how this is used even in a single sentence sometimes. Okay, so let's move on to signaling, and this is where we're reporting intent. So we want to know where information comes from, but we also want to know the author's attitude toward the information. So when we are citing, this is how we are ensuring that our readers know where information has come from. They can go and find that information and confirm that it exists. And if they start looking at those sources, they can also start to determine whether or not we've captured that information accurately. Because sometimes the information from other people's work isn't captured accurately, and that becomes a problem. And it also speaks to why, on the whole, we avoid secondary citation. Are folks familiar with the concept of secondary citation? So secondary citation, say you're reading a literature review, and seemingly it lays out all of the information that's going to be useful for you. And so the temptation is to just start citing what the authors of the literature review have cited, rather than go to the sources directly. But the issue is that sometimes when people are capturing information from other sources, they might not be articulating that information in a very accurate way. And I've certainly found that, because sometimes you are reading a literature review and you're like, oh, I have to go and look at this source because it seems incredibly relevant to what I'm writing about. And then you go and start reading that source and you start asking yourself, now, how did they come to that conclusion in their literature review? Because I'm not making the same connection. And so you want to avoid secondary citation because of that potential for distortion. Another reason is that sometimes you might not know if there's been a retraction, for instance. So just because something has been published in a reputable journal doesn't mean that it's not going to be interrogated and questioned by people after publication. And so sometimes you'll have articles that end up being retracted because other scholars start to question maybe the methodology and start to put pressure on the journal to say, you need to retract this because it's not actually good scholarship. If you are someone who's interested in sort of academic gossip, the exciting world of academic gossip, there's a website called Retraction Watch. And it's very, very informative as to the complexities of publication in academia, because scholars are under a lot of pressure to publish. And so sometimes this results in questionable scholarship that gets released. So that aside, avoid secondary citation, and also be very mindful of how you are capturing the information from other people's work. And that brings us to this next question. What is the author's attitude toward the information? And this helps us to think about the language that we're going to use to capture that notion of intent or attitude. I'm not going to read through this chart, this table. Excuse me. Excuse me. Oh my goodness, I got so overwhelmed seeing all of these words. But it's really to illustrate for you the fact that we have so much vocabulary available to us to articulate notions of intent. And intent relates to everything from like presenting conclusions, or reflect, like presenting conclusions, agreement, question, making recommendations, examining, makes a claim, provide explanation, emphasis. And when we just glance at this, a lot of these words are going to seem initially synonymous and interchangeable with each other. But when we start looking a little bit more closely, we'll start to recognize that some of this vocabulary actually has quite strong connotations in the English language. And so these words, this vocabulary is not unavailable to us, because if it captures the intent, these are going to be useful words that we have access to, but we want to really be sure before using some of this language. Because if we start to use language like challenges, complains, contends, contradicts, denies, refutes, rejects, demands, urges, warns, scrutinizes, argues, claims, insists, stresses, these have a very strong connotation, right? And so we are basically making a statement about what the author's attitude is toward what they're sharing with the world. So we just want to be mindful of the fact that certain words have certain connotations that can be stronger than other words. So we'll take a look at a short piece of academic writing and try and figure out, okay, well, what kind of reporting or signal verbs are being used here? So let's read through. This is from an article entitled Exploring the Boundaries of Authorship, a Comparative Analysis of AI-Generated Text and Human Academic Writing in English Literature. And it reads as follows. The interplay between technology and writing has long fascinated scholars. Foundational work by Bolter and Ong examined how emerging technologies redefined writing practices, while more recent studies by Hales and Barron evaluated the impact of digital technology on reading habits and literary creation. However, until recently, there was a gap in understanding the unique implications of AI-generated text on academic writing. A recent study by Bassick et al. Provided insight into this area by conducting a comparison of student-composed essays and those written with the help of ChatGPT. The research centered on the efficacy of ChatGPT-3 as an essay writing assistance tool. Interestingly, they found no significant improvement in essay quality, writing speed, or authenticity when students used ChatGPT. On the contrary, those students who wrote essays independently of the tool achieved slightly better overall scores, a phenomenon potentially attributed to over-reliance of the other group on the tool or unfamiliarity with it. These findings corroborate a previous study on GPT-2, where students found using the tool more challenging than simply writing directly and expressed concerns about the sources of the generated text. Okay, so what kind of reporting or signal verbs are we starting to notice? What kinds of verbs are being used when making reference to these other sources? And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sources being referenced here.
Exam evaluated.
Found, evaluated,
Impact.
impact.
Would the fascinated in the first sentence also be like a bit of a broader statement about the field in general?
Yeah, it's not specific to any of the cited sources, I would argue. Though it's sort of in the periphery of, yeah, it's sort of this broad statement, right?
Expressed concerns.
Express concerns,
Corroborate.
corroborate, yeah. So it's not the most exciting language choice, right? We have examined, evaluated, provided insight, found, corroborate. And this is kind of typical in a lot of academic writing, right? We're not necessarily reaching for the most exciting reporting verbs. And this is often because we want to be measured a lot of the time when we're making reference to the work of other people. But again, a really useful exercise for yourselves is to find 1 or 2 articles in your discipline and quickly go through the literature reviews, for instance, and take note of the reporting verbs being used in that discipline. Because again, depending on your discipline, you might see a larger or smaller range of verbs being used. And that's not to say that you can't push back a little bit. So maybe you really like the verb corroborate, for instance, and you're not really seeing it in your discipline. You're not restricted from using that reporting verb. But when we go through and look very closely at how scholars in our field are just using language generally, that helps us to sort of build sort of mental model of communication expectations within our field. So keep that in mind as you're working on your writing. Okay, so now let's talk about situating or anchoring evidence. As I read through this little excerpt, my question is, what knowledge does the reader lack? And you can think of yourself as the reader in this instance. Susan Bordeaux writes about women and dieting. Fiji is just one example. Until television was introduced in 1995, the islands had no reported cases of eating disorders. In 1998, 3 years after programs from the United States and Britain began broadcasting there, 62% of the girls surveyed reported dieting. So, if you are at all confused as a reader, what might be accounting for that confusion? What kind of questions might you have? What kind of information might you be looking for to make more sense of this quotation? And I'm keeping an eye on that chat just in case anything pops up.
Maybe like the differences in how they reported cases before 95 and how it changed between things and executive effects. You know, their numbers, I guess, or how they.
So are there changes in how people have been researching this topic? Yeah, because we see different approaches to research emerge time and time again, right? Sometimes we didn't ask certain questions previously because people didn't think to ask them.
I guess I don't know what the, how the quote is related to the actual author's context.
Mhm.
Like, an example of what? Like, in context to what the actual author is writing about as opposed to what the quoted author is writing about.
Mhm. So presumably this quote is from Susan Bordeaux. We have reference to her in that first sentence, which is bridging into the quotation. But like, what's the connection here? We have reference to Fiji as just one example. It's like an example of what, right? Example of women in dieting, but like, what's the nuance here? What's like, what aspect of that? So we might be looking for more information as readers. Anything else? Any other questions emerge? Does anyone know who Susan Bordeaux is? So we're left with questions. And one of the things that we always want to be mindful of as writers is that we're not in the room with our reader when they are reading. If we could be, then we would have to, we wouldn't have to put as much effort into our writing because we'd be there to answer any questions that a reader has. But we have to imagine a scenario where the writing has to articulate everything that we intended to, and it has to do so in a way that it can stand up to a reader's questions. Anytime we pause as a reader and we have questions, it can signal the fact that maybe we're encountering information that's just more complex than information we've encountered previously and we need time to process. That's a very valid reason why we might have to stop and really think about the stuff that we're reading. On the other hand, sometimes we're pausing and hesitating and having to reread because there's actually been a communication error. We haven't been given enough context. Things haven't been articulated in a way that is allowing for reader understanding. And this is something that we always have to be mindful of. So in this first instance, we're just lacking some context in order to make meaning from this quote. So we have to add some information. So we might write instead, the feminist philosopher Susan Bordeaux deplores Western media's obsession with female thinness and dieting. Her basic complaint is that increasing numbers of women across the globe are being led to see themselves as in need of a diet. Citing the islands of Fiji as an example, Bordeaux notes that until television was introduced in 1995, the islands had no reported cases of eating disorders. In 1998, 3 years after programs from the United States and Britain began broadcasting there, 62% of the girls surveyed reported dieting. So the question is, do we understand this quote more now that we have this context?
Yeah.
So we have this sort of framing, right? It's like, oh, this is a critique of the role of the media in relation to women and dieting and diet culture. So we have this framing that was basically completely absent from that first example. We might be able to infer it from the quote itself, but that's placing a lot of expectations on us as readers. And anytime we're expecting readers to do that kind of work, we risk them misinterpreting. And we don't want that because the purpose of writing and communicating is to try and establish shared knowledge. But if what we're trying to share isn't received in the way that we intend, communication starts to collapse. So sometimes we just need to provide a little bit more context, a little bit more detail. And again, this is always going to be context specific. It might be that maybe we need some simple references to chronology so that people can sort of keep information clear in their minds in terms of when things happened. It might be that we have references to organizations or researchers. Maybe we need that framing of more reference to certain theories, ideologies, philosophies. Maybe we need reference to demographics, geography, etc. The list really goes on and on and on. It's going to be dependent on what detail or idea you want to share with your readers. So how much detail do I need, right? Because if you're like me, and feel free to put your hand up if you've ever had this feedback, sometimes you include a little bit too much detail. Have you ever received that kind of feedback? Yeah, I'm even today, and I talk about writing, I teach writing, I will still get feedback from my colleagues saying, maybe you don't need this much detail, because I'll put information in that I find is interesting, even if it's not going to be that interesting for my reader. So we're always trying to develop this awareness of how much information does my reader need? How is it going to benefit them? So a couple of questions that you can ask yourself is, okay, if I'm including more detail about a particular study, for instance, why? Am I including more reference because I'm really going to critique that source in particular? That might be a really good justification for providing that added detail. Alternately, you might ask ourselves, well, what is it about this particular source that's notable? Like, why am I putting a spotlight on it? Because anytime we add more detail, we're indicating to our reader that this has something you need to pay attention to. So is the source so conventional that it acts as something, sort of acts as an example for larger trends? That can be really useful because readers tend to really gravitate toward concrete detail. And so if you have a source that's very conventional, it can be a stand-in for a greater number of sources. Alternately, it might be an outlier that you want to bring attention to, because when we have these distortions in a narrative, that's usually an indication that things aren't as settled as we expected them to be in that broader academic conversation. And so bringing attention to that reflects the fact that we recognize there's some complexity here. Alternately, you might ask, well, is this source particularly aligned to the current study? Like, is this very, very closely related to the research that I am doing? So looking at a very comparable population, for instance, because sometimes when we have studies that are so close to what we're doing, we need to grapple with them in order to articulate why our work is still worth doing. Because if it's so similar, we have to justify that something else has to still be done. So here we have a little excerpt from a study entitled Using Community Health Workers to Deliver a Scalable Integrated Parenting Program in Rural China, a cluster randomized controlled trial. And it reads as follows. The failure of the current study to find an effect on anemia is in line with findings from earlier nutrition interventions in rural China and Colombia. For example, an earlier large-scale home-based micronutrient supplementation intervention in rural China led to an improvement in hemoglobin levels after 6 months, but the researchers found no evidence indicating that the effect on anemia persisted 1 year after the end of the intervention. So half of, or more than half of this text is really focused on one study. Why do you think that is the case? Why do we have so much detail about one study and not the others? Why do you think this is the case?
This is actually in line with what they're expecting. Versus the others which might not be.
Possibly. But if it's in line with the findings from that study, it's also in line with the findings from those other two studies. So why foreground that 2017 study rather than the 2014 or 2016 studies?
The 2017 study is newer,
Mhm.
it's larger scale, and so they state that. And they give a bit more context into exactly the methodology, like the home-based micronutrient supplementation intervention.
Mhm.
And so maybe the other, it's like a stand-in for the other studies as well, like if they used either similar or methodology and maybe had smaller sizes, so they don't, like they're like a little less important, but they can all be clustered together and described with more detail in one of the studies.
So it is the newer study,
Mhm.
yeah, or at least the newer published study, because sometimes studies get published quite a few years after the work actually was undertaken. So the publication date is not always a proxy for when the research took place. But do we have any reference to those studies based in Colombia as being smaller scale?
I was just kind of assuming that the larger scale one you'd want to highlight because it's more prominent than the other two studies. Because if you had a cluster of 3 studies
Mhm,
and you elaborated on the one that was less prominent and its findings were less important
mhm.
or a little less strong, and then there's another one that you could use, then
Mhm.
you probably would use that one instead.
Yeah, and if that was articulated out to us,
Mhm.
I think that would be a persuasive argument.
Okay.
Based on the information we have here, we don't actually have any indication that the 2014 and 2016 studies are smaller than the 2017 study. But I like that line of thinking.
Maybe they just pick randomly because they said right now.
Potentially. Maybe they're like, oh, it's just going to be easier to write about this study than these other studies. It's unlikely that it was just a random choice. But there's still a decision-making process that's going on here, right? Where does the 2019 study take place? China,
Yeah.
right? So is it going to make more sense to make reference to a study in China or studies in Colombia? Yeah, so we have those 3 studies being referenced. We're also looking admittedly at probably an instance of self-citation, not going to avoid that. We would have to go and just double check, but based on the last name, it's likely that there's a little bit of self-citation that's happening here. And that's not unusual because researchers often specialize on a particular topic for a number of years. It could last their entire research career, but sometimes, for 5 to 10 years, they might be focused on something very specific. And if they are the experts and they're doing this research, it's going to make sense to cite your own work. But apart from that context, because we're looking at the same geography. And so this can be an instance for thinking about what sources you might choose over others. Because it might be that, yes, there's a slightly newer study, but maybe that's less relevant to the context in which you are researching. Okay, so now we're going to quickly talk about synthesis. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail simply because I give whole workshops on synthesis because it's such a big topic. But in simplest terms, synthesis is all about pattern recognition, where we are recognizing that studies sort of cluster together in terms of some of the information that we can make reference to. And as humans, we are pretty darn good at pattern recognition. And synthesis is about really building on that ability. So here we have an example of some fairly dense synthesis in practice. This is from an article entitled Healthcare Utilization in Canadian Children and Young Adults with Asthma During the COVID-19 Pandemic. And it reads as follows. There's limited literature examining the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in children and young adults with asthma. While recent literature suggests improved asthma control during the pandemic, it has reported mixed results on whether individuals with asthma have greater susceptibility to COVID-19. So how many studies are being cited in this sentence? Or sentences, in these sentences? Hmm. Yay, we have the chat. Thank you. Yeah, we have four. We have four studies, right? So we have 9, 10, 11, and 12 indicated through that little cluster of citation. Now, this that sort of density of citation will look a little bit different depending on the citation style that you use. But here we have one example. And the benefit of this is, wow, instead of having to write a sentence for every single study that we're making reference to, we can cluster them together based on the information that they share. And we support this by making a reference to literature or studies, for instance. And it's just a way to help direct readers very quickly to trends in the literature. And that can save a lot of reading time. And in a lot of academic publication contexts, you're often working within very restrictive word limits. So if you're in the position of writing a thesis, for instance, that's going to be one of the opportunities to write something that is sort of unusually long and detailed. Because if, again, depending on your discipline, if you're looking at journal articles, a lot of those are pretty short. And if you're thinking about maybe publishing in the future, it's worth looking at what the word limits are in different journals, just to get a sense of how, again, concise you might have to be with your writing. And so synthesis can help you make reference to that literature in a more concise way. And it can also help reduce the burden on readers because they're not having to read very similar information over and over and over and over again. So we synthesize for lots of different reasons. It's a very efficient way to cite multiple studies. And it can also help to demonstrate our critical thinking because we're recognizing the patterns that exist in the literature. And it can also, one of the benefits that's sometimes understated is that it can actually help us to avoid accidental plagiarism. Because when we're working very closely with individual sources, sometimes when we're paraphrasing or summarizing, it can be a little bit difficult to figure out words or phrasing that are sufficiently distinct from that original source. But if you're focused on patterns, you have to take a different perspective because you're trying to figure out how these things relate on a broader scale rather than focus on all of the individual details. So again, like I made reference to earlier, I give whole sessions about synthesis. So I don't have any live ones scheduled, but I believe there is a workshop recording available on the library website. Okay, so let's wrap up. As with anything that we're writing, we want to bring intentionality into it. And so when we're integrating evidence, that's the sort of focus that we're bringing. So we're making decisions all the time. Should I quote? Should I paraphrase? Should I summarize? Should I synthesize? What's going to be the most valuable for my reader? And we want to think about how we are attributing information, how we're signaling the author's attitude toward the work that they have shared, how we're situating or contextualizing information, and how we are synthesizing that information. And everything is always context-based. And so when we're deciding on the level of detail that we want to include, again, just bringing that same level of intentionality. Is my reader going to benefit from having access to this information or not? Am I just overwhelming them because I find this information personally interesting? Okay, so there are lots of great resources out there if you want to dig into this topic during your own time. So here are some resources related to research in gray literature and how you might go about integrating that information. And on the next slide, I'll share some resources that are more about writing about data, for instance. And so here are those sources. Okay, but that brings us to the end. So thank you so much for joining. Oh, look at that, some advertising. Yes, my last session is on Thursday. And it will also be hybrid, so you can come to G3 or you can join on Zoom. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to stick around and answer them to the best of my ability. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining, for participating. Make sure you grab snacks if you're in the room. And for those of you online, thank you for tuning in. And maybe I'll just hand it over.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Yeah, super great. That's lots of really good information, as always. So Morgana has put the link to the next workshop Jill is going to be providing again, which is scientific writing. So that's a great one on Thursday. I do want to promote just a couple of other dates. Next week on June 17th, we've added an event that's the introduction and information session for the Sure Storytelling competition. So that's launching again. If you don't know, the Sure Storytelling competition is a video competition. So an opportunity for you to take some workshops this summer and learn some different media production skills from our media production unit here on campus. And just learn a little bit about storytelling and research and how those two things are connected, both storytelling as a methodology, storytelling as research mobilization and a dissemination strategy, and as well just as media literacy. So there'll be a few workshops over the summer. We're hoping that you folks can be recording some of the research that you're doing and gathering some footage this summer. And then in the fall, there'll be an opportunity to create a video and submit that video as part of the competition. And it'll be sort of like an images of research kind of a voting process, an online sort of film festival kind of a thing. So the information session for that is next June 17th, I think that's a Wednesday. So make sure if you're interested in that, that's a great one to come to, get all your questions answered about that. And then the other date I wanted to mention was August 26th is the confirmed date for the Sure Symposium. So if you're looking to present your research from this summer at the Big Poster Symposium, that's August 26th. And we'll have sign up for that a little later in the summer, but just save the date for that one if you're interested in presenting your research this summer. From this summer, that's August 26th. I think that was it. Okay, thanks, folks. Thank you again, Jill.
Awesome. Stuff.
I have to get my USB.
What's that?
I have to grab my
Yeah,
USB.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Stuff.